It's the week ending Saturday the 6th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Britain reach a milestone of 10 million vaccinations against COVID-19, the civilian leader of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, ousted by a military coup, and the death from coronavirus of Captain Sir Tom Moore, who'd raised £33 million for the NHS at the age of 100. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, the boss man, Holden Frith. From the Week Junior, we have editor Felicity Capon, and we welcome back science correspondent for The Economist, Alok. And Holden, you're starting this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
If you're taking an indirect approach, you better be smooth.
This snake can travel at speeds of up to 18 miles per hour. This is the parent gaze adder, also called the sidewinder. Sidewinding is the equivalent of the horse's gallop in the snake world. It's the fastest way to get around. And speed aside, it's also the best way for a snake to cross loose, shifting sand.
A video from the Smithsonian Channel. You can find the whole thing on YouTube. So, Holden, gotta love this show. Sidewinding snakes. Why is this your story of the week?
Yeah, it's my latest attempt to turn this news podcast into a series about wild animals, or robots actually, which we might come to later. But yeah, what's given me the excuse this week is Jennifer Reza of Emory University in Atlanta, who's published research about how sidewinding snakes are able to move so quickly and efficiently across sand. She says it all comes down to microscopic pits or dimples on their scales, which help to reduce the friction between the skin of the snake and the ground. This sounds a bit counterintuitive because usually if you want something to go fast, you want as much friction as possible with the ground so that you can push back in order to sort of propel yourself forward. And that's what you see with most species of snake, which actually have tiny spikes on their scales, and that helps them create friction with the ground, push back against it and slither forwards. But on sandy ground, that sort of approach would tend to lead snakes to dig in rather than to slither across the ground. What you have with the sidewinder is a skin that allows it to have as little friction as possible, which means it can lift itself out of the sand really easily and then use its body almost like a steamship paddle against the ground to push itself forward.
Okay. Interesting news for snakophiles, if that's a word. For those of us who missed our copy of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences periodical in the post this week, I mean, what are the implications of this? Why is this important, do you think?
There's a few different implications. The most eye-catching is the one that has been touched upon in some of the reporting on this, which is that this sort of approach could be used in robotics, because a lot of the robots we see tend to either mimic people or they mimic cars, so they travel on wheels or they travel on some kind of foot-like device. But there are uses, this is a slightly alarming thought, there are uses where snake-like robots might be quite effective. For example, if you want them to cover soft ground after mudslides or earthquakes, that sort of thing.
But snakes aren't that fast, Felicity. I mean, the clip we just heard said that snakes can move at up to 18 miles per hour. That isn't exactly the fastest animal on the planet, is it? So why would we want to copy them? Surely we should be looking at panthers or something.
Well, I think we are, interestingly enough. Researching the story was a great excuse to go down some rabbit holes on YouTube and looking at the incredible videos of Boston Dynamics. But they have the world's fastest robot called Cheetah, which runs like a big cat at over 29 miles per hour, which is faster than the 100-metre world champion sprinter Usain Bolt. And just like a real cheetah, the robot, I mean, it's quite amazing when you watch the video. It has an articulated back that flexes back and forth with each step. It's incredible to watch. It goes so fast. So I think speed actually is something that in robotics is really important. I think Elon Musk has said that speed is the ultimate weapon, I suppose, speed and precision. But I suppose with the insects and, spiders and snakes and flies, we're imitating the natural world because they're so incredibly light and incredibly resilient. If you think about cockroaches or snakes and the ways in which they move their body, the types of spaces they could fit into, the areas that they could reach, there's so much to kind of mimic and imitate from the animal world because they would have gone through millions of years of evolution and natural selection, making them so adaptable, so versatile, so efficient. You know, if you're not the best, you would have been replaced by your better cousin at some point.
Alok, I'm so pleased you're here. What technology does get inspired by animals? Is Holden overblowing this a little?
Can I just say I don't like snakes at all? I don't like the way they move. I don't like the way they look at you, any of that stuff. And also the idea of having millions of robotic snakes just fills me with why? Just why would you want millions of... There are enough snakes in the world doing their thing. Why robotic snakes? On a more serious note, if you want robots to be useful in the future, you want them to be able to move in different ways. And animals do provide a lot of inspiration, actually, for robotics and general materials that people make. One of the most famous examples probably is the foot of the gecko. So the foot of the gecko has quite an interesting structure if you look at it under a very powerful microscope, which allows it to walk upside down, basically. And you can mimic that to create materials that are very, very sticky, which is useful. They found that, for example, the glue that barnacles use to stick to ships is so strong. It's one of the strongest glues, stronger than any glue that has ever been created by humans. And you understand that, you can suddenly create things which allow you to stick things in a more effective way. And these are all very useful things to do. I still don't want there to be more snakes, though.
And Holden, do you think, therefore, this kind of research often gets ignored? I mean, we've put it pride of place on this week's podcast as your story of the week. And actually, presumably, on a weekly, probably hourly basis, Alok's getting press releases of this sort, that they do get ignored, but they do have implications.
Yeah, and I think, even that framing of the question maybe is part of the problem of the way science tends to get reported in the mainstream press, is that it is about what are the practical applications.
Yeah, what does it mean for me?
Yeah, and that, you can understand that. Right now we're seeing the potentially huge applications of research that wasn't intended to provide the cure to this particular pandemic. The vaccines that we're now seeing rolled out across the world, work started on them years, sometimes decades ago, looking at other diseases and other problems, and then it finds its niche when the need arises. And I think a lot of science is like that. It's people looking at interesting problems or simply questions that haven't been answered, and requiring there to be an immediate practical application to everything all of the time might close off some avenues of exploration.
And Felicity, I wonder if another thing that's closed off some avenues is lockdown, and actually whether our current situation is stifling ingenuity a little bit, and some of this seemingly tangential research isn't happening like it normally does.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could argue it both ways. I think invention and ingenuity comes from the weirdest of places, and I suppose if you're not meeting new people or going to new places, you might have less around you to inspire you. On the other hand, I suppose if you have a sort of monotonous daily routine and you're doing the same thing every day, that could also be stifling that creative ingenuity. So it's hard to say, but I do think the story did kind of make me think of all the weird and wacky places that people find inspiration when it comes to the sciences, and it made me think of this amazing Latvian mathematician called Dana Tamina. And she proved that hyperbolic geometry, which was discovered in the 19th century, she could turn it into a physical, tactile model that you could actually see and feel. And that was because she was really good at crochet. And it was so interesting that looking at the world of, knitting and crafts and all these things that I suppose we think of sort of like soft, sort of feminine, trivial pursuits or something, could actually be incredibly useful and important in something like trying to prove hyperbolic planes, which is really, really interesting. And if you look it up, they are beautiful. These models are absolutely fantastic. It's a bit like a ruffled lettuce leaf or coral, and a hyperbolic plane is kind of the opposite of a sphere, so the space is curving away from itself at every point. But it's amazing when you think that something like crochet could be used in such an important way in mathematics and geometry.
I have to say, that's actually a really good example. Crochet and knitting, these are really, really good mathematical problems. The idea of how you make knots and how you undo knots and things, these are very hard mathematical problems that have all sorts of applications in computing and other places as well. So knitting is a very mathematical thing. Yeah, don't knock it. It's a very interesting thing.
But this kind of like cross-discipline evolution of scientific research is something presumably that happens partly when, I guess, idiots like me are able to communicate the academic advances that have been made in the science world. And equally when scientists have some sort of artsy background in addition to being scientists, because those things do need explaining, don't they, Holden? And, we saw just this week, didn't we, an increase in STEM subjects being taught at university and fewer people applying for arts degrees. You do kind of need people with a background in both.
Yes, and I think, there's been quite a lot of talk about the space program in particular, and I've seen interviews with NASA veterans from the 60s saying they really wish they'd had more writers or artists involved in the lunar missions, because the sort of longevity of the cultural impact of that has been enormous, of course. But the people who went to the moon, with one or two exceptions, haven't necessarily been the people who've been best at communicating that passion. There's been quite a lot of sort of reluctance, really, to talk about the philosophical aspect of it, or that the kind of profound effect it had on the world. People want to talk much more about, or are much happier talking about, the science and engineering side of it. One aspect of this research is that it gives a glimpse of evolution in progress, because there are distinct species of sidewinders which evolved independently at different times. And you can compare the sidewinding rattlesnake, which is found in relatively young deserts in the southwest of the United States. Those deserts formed only about 15 to 20,000 years ago. And they have some of these dimples on their skin that help them move across sand, but they also have some of the vestigial spikes left over, which just it's not that long ago that their ancestors were moving across hard ground. If you then compare them with their cousins in the Namib Desert in Namibia, which is 55 million years old, they're completely smooth. They don't have any of these spikes at all. So you can sort of get a sense of these long, long time periods and huge swathes of land and deserts and open spaces. And I think me sitting in the room I've been sitting in for almost a year now at my laptop, the idea of just sort of gaining access vicariously to that sort of sense of time and space really appealed.
So I am a total space cadet, so I background what I'm about to say with that caveat, and I was inspired by the Apollo moon landings and all of those things. But astronauts are the most boring people in the world because they're trained to be very, very boring, because they're meant to be calm under pressure. If your rocket is about to explode, you need someone to very calmly sort it all out. And so you're absolutely right, Ollie. You need other people with passions and interest in talking to other humans to make all this stuff much, much more accessible and interesting.
And yet, of course, here we all are, unable to make any subject dull, even if it's about sidewinding snakes. Felicity, you're up next after this. Okay, Felicity, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
It's okay, Rihanna. We're here to tell you what's going on in India.
You see, patience is the shield and the sword that the farmers are using in this agitation. For some reason, the government is pushing the farmers hard to lose patience. What happened today was not part of the plan. There is a committee which manages, but there are, as I said, 500 organizations, and something went out of circuit today. It shouldn't have happened. We will have to review it. We will have to have deep and deliberate discussions. It's a very critical moment. I completely agree with that. But I think to put the blame entirely on the farmers' organizations as having committed violence and arson, and there are many other adjectives going around, is harsh and one-sided.
Indian Farmers representative Avik Saha speaking to BBC News last week. And actually, Felicity, this is a story that's been rumbling along in the background for quite some time, the farmer protests in Delhi. Tell us how they started, what happened this week, and why you referenced Rihanna.
Well, I'll start with Rihanna because, actually, you're right. This story has been rumbling on for months, but it really feels like it fit the bill for this podcast in that it hasn't really been picked up that much. It hasn't really got the attention it should have done until this...
In the UK.
Yeah, in the UK, exactly. Until this week, I suppose, when both Rihanna and Greta Thunberg tweeted about it. Rihanna said something like, "Why aren't we talking about this?" And the tweet went viral, and I just thought it was amusing that the week we decided to put on the podcast, these two very high-profile people were talking about it. But it's a huge story in terms of significance and scope and sheer numbers involved, and basically what it all comes down to is that there are hundreds of thousands of farmers who have kind of blocking and barricading the entrance to Delhi on some of the major highways. They've been there for weeks now, and they're protesting against agricultural reforms that they say will change the agricultural industry in the country, how it's worked for decades. It's a really, really big deal. They're demanding the repeal of 3 new agricultural laws that has been passed by the government, they say, without their consultation. And the changes means that big retailers could buy directly now from growers, which would mean the end of long-standing guaranteed prices, known as minimum support prices, meaning that, selling their crops, they're now incredibly sort of vulnerable and they could be exploited by the whims of big business.
Except presumably if big buyers can directly access farmers, the farmers who benefit from that will be quite keen on this change, won't they? So is this kind of all farmers who are up in arms about this, or just the ones who fear they're going to lose out?
I mean, there will be winners and losers. The government insists that prices will be driven up and that it will give farmers more freedom, but certainly the farmers do not feel this way. And when you think that, they first marched on Delhi in November and they were supported by 250 million people across India who went on strike, and some people are saying that's arguably the world's largest ever protest. The protesters are also united across religion, so there are predominantly Sikhs but also Muslims and Hindus who are also unhappy about it, and that's quite remarkable. Some farmers protesting have actually died of cold. These protests are really huge and they are really, really serious. And when you think that India is a nation of 1.4 billion people and agricultural workers make up half of the labour force, the ramifications of the story are absolutely huge.
Holden, the government presumably put these reforms in place quite aware that there would be a backlash from farmers. Perhaps they didn't think it would look exactly like this, but they knew they wouldn't be happy. So what do you think their calculation is?
There seems to be a general consensus of, two things, in fact. One is that India's agricultural system is very, very bureaucratic and that reforms of some sort are needed, but then that these particular reforms have been handled badly. And it seems that what happened was that Modi brought them in initially as an emergency coronavirus-related measure without consultation, and then turned it into a permanent change, again without consultation, and only then started talking to farmers' leaders much more recently once the protests were underway.
So there wasn't really a calculation, there was just a suck it and see.
I don't know whether it had been something that was long planned and was brought forward, or whether it was just something that was done on the spur of the moment. But the sort of fundamental problem is that about 85% of India's agricultural land is divided up into farms that are about the size of 2 football pitches. And so that, if you're looking at that from a sort of bird's eye view, a government view and a sort of food production view, that's just not an efficient way of using land. It's very hard to bring in modern agricultural techniques, bigger equipment, that the sort of investment that's been driving up yields elsewhere. But if you look at it from the point of view of small farmers, they're worried that all of those changes would mean a consolidation of farming, which mean you'd get a few big farms making a lot of profit and producing a lot of food, and the smaller farmers who are just making enough to get by will be pushed out of business.
And Alok, that chap we heard being interviewed by BBC News was being interviewed on the day that the protest turned violent. And as Felicity pointed out, they've been going for 60 days before that point. So, it's sort of hard to avoid the conclusion, isn't it, that people aren't interested in reporting or responding to a peaceful protest, but the moment it gets violent, those images of protesters, they were scaling the Red Fort on Republic Day in India, that got attention.
So violence always gets attention, but it's not to say that the protesters themselves intended violence to happen. There's another factor here, which is that Narendra Modi is a controversial figure around the world. He is popular in India amongst Hindus, less so amongst the other ethnic minorities there. He's very much a Trumpian figure around the rest of the world. He sort of uses and misuses social media to get his messages across. He stifles dissent. If you're either with him or against him, it's very Trumpian. In fact, when Trump was elected back in 2016, his team had all gone to understand from Modi how to get populist uprisings to support you. And what we've seen in India in the last few years is Modi cracking down on dissent, cracking down on journalists, arresting journalists, stopping the internet from working in certain places. So yes, it might be that people around the world have not been focused on these farmers' riots so much, but it's also because anyone who has reported on them in India in the sort of free press has been essentially silenced. There are newspapers and television channels in India that essentially are government mouthpieces, or they will report whatever the government line is so that they don't get into trouble. But it's no exaggeration to say that information out of India is very, very unreliable, and it's very hard to know what's really going on.
Except a lot of Indians use social networks like Twitter, don't they? And they use it in English, so I can see what they're saying. And there is a lot of support out there for the farmers. I mean, Felicity, do you think this strategy of charging journalists with sedition, shutting down internet connectivity in Delhi, do you think is actually working? Do you think the government can control the narrative now or not?
I don't know. I mean, it seems like a war of attrition. Both sides are really sort of determined. And I mean, the commitment of the farmers, they're incredibly organised. And I think it is important to point out that up until basically this week, they were very, very peaceful. It's hard to see where this story goes. I think there is now a lot of international sort of outcry about this. And I think the point about Modi's response and kind of curtailing free speech and these crackdowns, there is this fear that India is going down this kind of path of intolerance and if there is a contentious policy, and there have already been lots of contentious policies recently in India, that the way the government handles that is less than desirable. I mean, you just have to look at the fact that India is the world's most populous democracy, but in 2019 it topped the world in terms of the number of internet shutdowns. So this definitely seems par for the course in how the India government treats these contentious issues, which I think is very, very worrying.
And Holden, if you look at India's place in the annual World Press Freedom Rankings, they're 142nd and dropped 2 places last year. I just sort of wonder in the broader context this week of the issues that are happening in Russia with Navalny and I guess in Myanmar as well to an extent. Even still, the repercussions of what happened in the US, with the sort of battle of is it real, is it fake news, and ultimately everything that Trump left behind. We're in a position now where this seems almost par for the course in so many countries.
Yeah, and I think the comparison with the US and Trump might actually be the most apposite here, because you actually had the Indian government asking Twitter to suspend the accounts of protesters and journalists, in fact, and Twitter did block about 250 accounts to begin with. They seem to be following the precedent of what happened after the Capitol Hill riots, when a lot of the leaders of that movement had their accounts shut down, and of course President Trump himself. But several hours later, Twitter did actually restore those, saying they were newsworthy, they did represent free speech. But this sort of just shows the way that the social media giants, who were so desperate to keep themselves out of that sort of editorial decision, have been dragged into it. And having resisted it for so long in the States, they decided they had to take action there, and now they are going to be involved in all of those sorts of protests around the world. The battle for control of the narrative on social media, as well as the mainstream media in India, has been really clear during these protests. There's been ministers who've been tweeting out manipulated video that shows, the claim was initially that protesters had been beaten. The video then gets shown which suggests that they haven't. More video emerges. You have the front line of what's happening with the protesters and the police, and then behind that you have the sort of accompanying media battle about what do these images show, who's the victim, who's being hurt. And that's something that I think is just now, as you say, going to be par for the course for any sort of protest movement wherever it happens.
And Alok, you said that Modi's pushing a lot of buttons. Why is agriculture kind of the hot button? Why is this the thing that's got people out in the streets? Why is it the Black Lives Matter, equivalent? What is it significant about agriculture in India that's caused that?
One reason could be that most of Indian workers, that's where they work. India is still a very agrarian country. We see stories about the tech hubs in the south of the country, and of course you've got Bombay and Delhi, these very international cities. But the vast majority of the population still lives essentially on a form of subsistence agriculture and selling crops for their next year's money. People live in villages that they're barely making enough to feed their families. This is what they do. And so changing it is going to be incredibly important. But these aren't the first complaints that farmers have had about the way that the government's treated them for decades now because of major industrial projects. Farmers have been committing suicide because of the way that the country's been industrialized and developed. Now, you can argue that development is a good thing for everybody concerned, but you are going to essentially put a lot of people, the vast majority of people in the country, out of work, or have to retrain them quickly, which the Indian government is not doing on the flip side of all this. So there's going to be huge income and wealth gaps in all of this happening. If I could just answer one point you made, Ollie, earlier about why now that we're noticing this stuff. Well, I think a couple of reasons. The erosion of democracy in India has been going on for a very long time. It's been going on for many, many years through multiple ways. We've talked about the dissent we've talked about, or the stifling of dissent, subjugation of Muslims, the reorganization of how Jammu and Kashmir is governed, and these things have been going on for a long time. So you can't blame one person or one thing. And for the last 4 years, there's been no external pressure to stop the country doing anything. So the government's been able to get away with anything. The Trump administration in America, which normally America would be the government sort of saying, this is not a good idea, they've just been absent. And Modi and others have been allowed to get away with it. And of course, in the last 12 months, we've had COVID. So everyone's been focused inwards. We've got a new administration in America. I'd be really intrigued to see how they're going to respond to this, because they can't have the world's biggest democracy in a place like South Asia, have that be something which is so unstable and sort of going against traditional liberal values. So I'd be interested to see what happens next.
Yeah, and the US ambassador in Delhi has already started encouraging dialogue. That's their line at the moment. Felicity, what do you think finally is actually going to happen next on this?
As I was saying before, I don't know, because I feel like the government is pretty committed to these reforms, and I'm not sure. I mean, you sort of think they would have to back down in the face of the enormity of the protest, but I'm not sure they're going to, and especially of all this stuff that we've been talking about the sort of the crackdown and the cutting off the internet suggests that they're kind of, their response is going to be pretty feisty, as it always is, whether it's the citizenship laws or the recent clampdown on disputed Kashmir region or whatever it is. But I mean, again, as I was saying, the protesters are very, very organised. They, care about this deeply. They have a lot of support across the country, and now that does seem to be spreading around the world. So I think it remains to be seen, and I'm not sure I'd like to make a prediction.
Okay. Alok, you're up next after this. All right, Alok, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
What do you do if you're a vegetarian and you feel guilty about giving your pets meat?
Pet food is big business. The global pet food market is predicted to be worth $113 billion by 2025. But it's not a great business for the planet. A 2017 study estimated that in the United States, pet food is responsible for a quarter of the environmental impacts of meat production, in terms of the use of land, water, fossil fuels, phosphates and pesticides. The US doesn't even have the highest rate of pet ownership, and developing countries are catching up. Now, though, more meat-free products are coming onto the market.
A video from the Financial Times called "Can Meat-Free Products Curb Pet Food's Environmental Impact?" So, Alok, can meat-free products curb pet food's environmental impact?
So there is a level of guilt for people who want to be ethical about the world and, not eat meat, fly less, all those things, who want to be environmentally friendly. And you might, if you've got pets, then, what do you do about that? Because cats and dogs have to eat meat. That's kind of their evolutionary job, right? Surveys show that people who have pets in the West also often tend to be vegetarians and vegans. So how do you sort of square that circle? So there's a company in Philadelphia called Because Animals, and this week they announced their plans to grow mouse meat using mouse stem cells. So you take stem cells from the skin of a mouse and then you put them into cell culture in a laboratory, grow them up, and you have lots more of these muscle cells essentially. And that is something edible for your cats and any other animals any other pets you have. The idea being that growing something in a lab doesn't involve harming any animals, but it is real meat. So this is something that people have been trying for more than a decade.
So, I mean, the question is, I suppose, whether it's actually vegan then. Because if it's lab-grown meat, it's still meat. It's
still meat, but it's not harming any animals. That's the purpose here. So the idea is that the cells that started the culture came from an animal that, according to the owners of the company, then went on to retire and have a very nice life in a plush mouse house, as they called it. So it didn't kill the animal. The animal wasn't hurt in any way. It was just a sort of skin biopsy. And then what you do is you take that, and mouse stem cells will grow very nicely in laboratory conditions if you just give them the right sorts of nutrients.
Okay, it's fascinating because on my comedy podcast, Answer Me This, I remember we were once asked, why can't you buy mouse-flavoured cat food? And from my 5 minutes Googling, I seem to recall the answer to that question is because you can't get rodents onto approved lists of ingredients for consumption in the home, even if you're going to give it to a cat. But cats probably would choose mouse-flavoured cat food, so I think cats are going to be well behind this. But does it have the same nutritional value as an actual mouse?
Well, so if it's a mouse muscle cell, it doesn't matter if it's grown in the lab or it's grown within the mouse. It's still a mouse muscle cell. You'll get the protein. What you might not get is the other nutrients that a mouse might have, like the fat cells also are quite useful. You could add other nutrients as well artificially. So, the stuff you make at the end of it would have the protein from the mouse, which is the important thing. It would taste like mouse, but then you would obviously have to maybe flavor it and other things. Again, it would be real protein from a real mouse eventually, but much, much more ethically sourced.
But, Felicity, this sounds expensive to manufacture at the moment. It will therefore also, presumably when it hits the shelves, be more expensive to buy. Faced with competition of packet of pedigree chum for £1, it's going to be a tough mountain to climb, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that is one consideration. But just going back a step, I think this kind of assumption that it is more ethical and better for the environment and greener, I'm actually not convinced that's necessarily the case. I think there has been a lot of research that is still being debated and disputed about whether lab-grown meat is better for the environment in terms of emissions. And I think at the moment, it's very energy intensive to produce, is my understanding, and that although people talk about cows producing lots of methane, I think these labs produce a lot of carbon dioxide, which arguably stays in the atmosphere a lot longer and contributes to global warming. So I'm just not convinced that we should just assume straight off that even if we could get it really, really cheap, it would be better for the environment. And part of that, I think, is that these companies who are making cultured meat aren't really releasing the data on their production process and how much energy it's using up, because obviously they don't want their competitors to get hold of the information. So I feel like there's a lot that we don't know about this. And I just feel, and this is a bit controversial, but I don't actually think that grass-fed meat is that bad for the environment. I think it's intensive farming that's bad for the environment, and we should reform the ways we farm animals, but I don't think we should stop eating meat. So I would just go back to the fact that I think assuming that this is better for the environment, I'm not convinced that's true.
And that's where the price point does come in, though, isn't it, Holden? Because actually, if you do have money to spend on your pets, maybe you would be better off buying something organic, locally sourced and whatever. Okay, yes, you have harmed an animal because the animal is dead, but almost everything else about it environmentally might be better than buying something lab-grown.
In some ways, I think it's similar to the conversation we had a couple of months ago about electric battery-powered cars versus hydrogen fuel cells for trains and ships and possibly planes. Like there may well be different solutions for different uses. And I've certainly noticed a lot of the sort of high-end butchers are now actively marketing themselves as a treat food. So they're sort of pushing the idea that you eat less meat and you eat better meat and it becomes a treat. And I think the concern Felicity raised about just how green is this approach, I think is a fair point to raise, but also it's an industry in its infancy, so it may well be that these efficiencies improve over time. The attention has been with these sort of lab-grown meats or plant-based meat alternatives has usually been on human consumption in supermarkets and, do they taste like a real burger? Could you make a steak out of them? But maybe that's actually not the real niche they will find. Maybe it is actually producing a cheaper, lower quality or less appealing to humans form of protein that you can then use in sort of mass market cheap animal feed, and you cut out a lot of carbon emissions and water consumption that would otherwise be going into that sort of feed.
But Alok, if the human example, as in food for humans example, is the informative one, then actually what's happened is the lab-grown meat gets all the headlines and people talk about it for 10 years, and then what you end up with basically is Beyond Burger, which is great, but it is essentially posh Quorn, isn't it? It's nothing new. It's just plant-based imitation meat. And if that's the solution for animals, if that's what the market decides is easier to make and easier to sell, you can argue that isn't as healthy for them.
I think Holden raises a really, really important point, which is that this is an industry in its infancy. The technology is going to get better, and there are lots of ideas being trialled at the moment, whether it's pet food or Beyond Burgers or whatever else. There's a whole continuum of ideas from growing things in labs to essentially mimicking the effects of meat, the sort of taste and bite of meat, using plants, using very complex food engineering.
Yeah, but what if it does end up with plant-based? That's what I'm saying. If it ends up and the solution is plant-based, and you're an animal lover and you don't want to feed them animals, but you're an animal lover then feeding your animals unnatural products. I mean, that in itself is a problematic situation for an animal lover, isn't it?
Well, no, I think that there's going to be a mix of solutions. So if we're all being completely healthy as humans, we should be eating a little less meat for the environment, but also it's generally healthier just to eat more plants. I think that these different companies, these different places are trying to mimic these things because that's what people's flavors and tastes are. That's where we are at the moment. In 10, 20, 30 years, it might be that we all think farming cows for beef is a really weird thing to do. It just might change in the future, and therefore you're not going to have to worry about growing lots and lots of cows or having all these battery farm chickens and stuff. If we can get rid of a layer of very factory farmed, mass agricultural produced meat, which is no good for the animals and it's no good for us nutritionally, we can replace that with cheaper, more environmentally friendly, either laboratory grown or industrially produced meat or plant-based meat mimics, then that would be a net win, I think, for nutrition, for the animals, and for the environment.
I mean, there is a solution at the moment for dogs, not cats. Cats do kind of need to eat the real thing, don't they? But there's a solution for dogs, which is insects, mushed up insect protein. That's on the shelves now.
Totally.
It's growing. Still pretty niche.
There's so much insect out there, and it's totally environmentally friendly. We should all be eating insects, absolutely. Have you ever tried any?
I have.
I've tried some insects.
Yeah, and we're all making the same face. It's fine.
They're not bad.
It's as nice as a bad salted peanut in a bar, isn't it? So it's a good replacement for that.
Agreed.
But they're not as popular, Felicity, as they might be for dogs at the moment, and they exist, is my point. That product is out, and yet the public are not rushing to buy it.
Yeah, I mean, is it? I didn't realise it was out. I don't own a pet, so I'm not sure why it would be aware. But I mean, presumably it's not something that you just find on the shelves next to all the other. I mean, it's not sort of ubiquitous, is it? It must still be a kind of a novelty thing. And I think especially in this country, such a nation of pet lovers, that I imagine, judging by the faces that we all just made on Zoom, I imagine there's a squeamishness about feeding our beloved pooches insects if we can give them pedigreed chunks of whatever. So I imagine that will take a long time for people to stomach, no pun intended.
I think the phrase pedigree chunks of whatever is quite a revealing one when it comes to pet food, because feeding newly developed forms of food to animals feels as if it should be a way of getting around human squeamishness. But when you factor in the feelings that pet owners have towards their pets, that squeamishness still exists. But if we knew what was in a can of dog food, I'm sure that would be far more off-putting than something that's been grown in a sterile lab somewhere with great care and attention.
But presumably what's being stuffed into cans of dog meat is kind of the leftover bits, the undesirable bits of animals that we're raising for human consumption, right? And so as long as that's continuing, that we want to have our steaks and whatever, we might as well use up the whole of the animal in however way we can, whether that's making fats or candles or putting it into pet food, because presumably it's better to use up these animals that we are wanting to eat. And that seems a more efficient way of sort of using the whole animal. So while we are still consuming, meat, regardless of whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, we might as well be giving the entrails and the undesirable bits to our dogs and cats. All
right, entrails seems like the right point to end the show every week. So treats and nibbles all round to Felicity, Holden and Alok. Remember, you can subscribe to this show for free. There's a treat. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.